I want you to imagine this scenario. You're trying your project, you're climbing at your max, but suddenly you feel this nagging pain in your arm that just won't go away. And before you know it, trying hard isn't even an option anymore because your arm just can't keep up. It's frustrating, demoralizing, and unfortunately it was all that I was experiencing for the first 2 years of my climbing. There are a few things I wish I had known earlier about my brachialis injury and how to deal with it, and in this video I'm going to share with you my journey with it, from the first acute injury to then the habits and behaviors that made it worse, and finally to the turning point that allowed me to go from not being able to lift a glass of water to drink it to now being able to do one-arm pull-ups and of course improving in my climbing. So let's get into it. First of all, let's talk a bit about the brachialis muscle itself. I didn't know much about it at the time, but the brachialis is actually the primary muscle that is responsible for elbow flexion. It sits underneath the biceps and is actually much bigger and stronger than the biceps itself. The difference between them is that the biceps does elbow flexion when the arm is in a supinated position, so when your palm is facing up, as it would be when you're doing the normal dumbbell curls or when you're holding an undercline climbing, for example. On the other hand, the brachialis is responsible for elbow flexion when the arm is in a pronated position, so when your palm is facing down. So essentially in most of the cases when we are climbing on where we are doing pull-ups, right? And the difference in the pain you feel when you have a brachialis injury versus the other common tendinopathies in climbers, for example when you have golfers or tennis elbow, is that you don't feel the pain on top of your elbow, but you actually feel it a bit higher and deep inside the tissue here. And you might feel it getting worse when you're doing some deep lock-off or when you're doing big explosive moves, for example. Funnily enough, I didn't injure my brachialis tendon during climbing itself, but it actually happened way before I had even started climbing at all. It was actually during kickboxing, holding pads for people who, let's say, cared more about looking strong rather than being technical or accurate with their hits. To stabilize a joint, you actually need to contract both agonist and antagonist muscles at the same time, and you can imagine the type of damage that my brachialis sustained by getting kicked repeatedly by dudes that weighed more than 100 kilos. Anyway, if it was only the acute injury, I'm sure my troubles wouldn't have lasted long. But at the same time as I started getting into climbing, there were also many behavioral patterns that I exhibited that definitely didn't help it heal at best or were actively destructive at worst. And it's those habits that I want to turn to now. To understand the broader context, the time that I got into climbing was also the time that I was starting my PhD. And this, as you can imagine, came with a lot of stress associated with it. It was kind of like a pebble thrown in water that sends waves going in all directions. For one example, I would often engage in emotional eating patterns where I would often eat a bunch of cookies or croissants in one go, which would lead to a very unhealthy nutritional profile full of processed sugars and fats, neither of which helps with your tendons getting better, as you can imagine. I would also often sleep in very inconsistent patterns, often getting less than 6 hours of sleep per night, which also has very widespread negative impacts on your health, unfortunately. I would also often stay at the lab until very late, and I would go to the climbing wall for example, for the last half an hour or so, which means that I would skip completely the warm-up, I would jump directly on the wall, and then I would have to go up in difficulty, and I would be working at limit climbs for me at the time very quickly because obviously I was running out of time, and I was obviously very bad technically as a beginner, which means that I would be climbing very stiffly, I would lock things off all the time, and I would also be paying very minimal attention to my feet, which means that they would slip very often, and then my tendons would be like shock loaded every time, and this made sure that my tendons were re-injured essentially every time I would go to the wall. And then because of the pain, I would obviously stay away from the wall for like 2 weeks, let's say, to let it rest. And then I would repeat the same pattern where I would go just for a little time, and then the cycle begins anew every time. And this whole cycle lasted for a good year and a half at least, which was very painful and frustrating, as you can imagine. And I wish that right now I could go back and talk to my younger self and talk some sense into him, but you know, here we are. Hey, come in, come in.
Hey, who are you?
I'm you, from the future. Please sit down, have a glass of water.
Okay.
Injured again?
Yeah, man, it hurts a lot.
That sucks, doesn't it?
What are you doing here, though?
Yeah, I'm here to give you some good news and some bad news. Which ones would you like first?
Okay, I guess good news first.
Well, the good news is that your injury can get better actually, and that you can actually get stronger than you've ever been before.
Okay, and what about the bad news then?
Well, the bad news is that it will take quite a bit of time and that you will need to change quite a few things about your life. Yeah. I did see a couple of doctors at the time, but the advice they gave me wasn't really that helpful because they focused on the old, outdated RICE approach, which stands for rest, ice, compression and elevation, which is now recognized that doesn't really help you with overcoming long-term tendon injuries. At some point, as you can imagine, I had just had enough and I sought help from a physiotherapist, Phil Mack, who is also a climber. And even though the few sessions that we did were quite expensive for me as a broke PhD student, I still consider this decision to be one of the best ones that I've made in my life, at least relating to climbing. So Phil did a proper assessment of my injury and then proceeded to do a number of acute treatments on my tissue, which was like deep massage, dry needling and applying K-tape. But by far the two biggest contributions Phil had to my recovery was to give me some rehab exercises and to tell me to not stay away from the wall. Instead, he told me to go to the climbing wall, but focus on doing a lot of high volume but low intensity climbs. So it was quite challenging for me to stay 2 or 3 grades below my max, which at the time was gonna be just the entry level problems. But I really stuck to it even though it required a lot of discipline. The rehab exercises were quite simple. They only required a band and for me to do these reverse curls that focused on the brachialis muscle by having the hand being in a pronated position. I would have to do a few reps of those in the morning and in the evening, as well as doing them as a warm-up before my climbing sessions. And I actually did do those rehab exercises quite religiously, which helped. So the term that applies to this approach is actually police. No, not that one. I mean prevention, optimal loading, and then ice, compression, elevation, which is now the more accepted method for dealing with these kinds of injuries. Okay, so let's fast forward to now. I can happily say that I feel my injuries in less than like 1% of my climbing sessions, but I can definitely feel that without commitment to proper long-term behavioral change, they can definitely come back. I would categorize these changes into 3 broad categories, which I think of as getting smarter, getting stronger, and getting better. And I'll go through each one of these in turn. In terms of getting smarter, what I mean is all the behaviors that I mentioned before. For example, getting now consistent, good quality sleep, improving my nutrition, and also adhering almost religiously to a thorough warm-up every time before I climb. And I actually made a video about warming up for climbing, which you can find either in this link somewhere here or in the description below. Getting stronger involved doing initially the banded exercises that I mentioned, then moving on to doing the same exercises with a dumbbell, then pull-ups and weighted pull-ups, all the way up to being able to do one-arm pull-ups at this point. I also made a video about how to achieve your one-arm pull-ups, so you can find that in the description below as well. But basically, it's by adhering to the fundamental training principles of consistency, progressive overload, and adequate rest and recovery that I keep harping on in most of my videos. Finally, I got better at climbing. even though I'm obviously far away from mastering the technical aspects of the sport. But at the very least, I learned how to not abuse my arms all the time and how to pay proper attention to my feet so they don't slip constantly and I don't re-injure myself every time I climb. Something that has helped me with improving my technique is paying proper close attention to my movements, something that I discussed in my previous video about the book Rock Climbing Technique by John Kettle, and please watch that for some additional tips if you're interested as well. Okay, so we've come to the end of the video. I hope that if you have a similar injury, you have learned something that will be useful to you, but that at the very least you have gotten some hope that things can get better if you adhere to some fundamental principles for living a healthier life and training properly. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe for more climbing and training content, and see you all in the next video.